Hey there, I'm Terry from Marie Soapworks, and today I'm going to be showing you how I made this bar. This technique is called One Pot Wonder, and it is a technique inspired by Tania of Soapish, and it is the technique that is featured for the June of 2020 Soap Challenge. Check the description below for information on Tania and on the Soap Challenge. Okay, let's get started. First, I use about 1/3 to 1/2 of my water weight in distilled water ice cubes, and then I top off the remaining water weight with cold distilled water. Next, I gear up for safety and I measure my sodium hydroxide. This technique is not for beginners, and I'm assuming that you have the knowledge of safety. But if you're new to soap making, you can check out a video that I linked below on lye safety, and I would just suggest starting off with a much more simple batch. Next, I measure the sodium lactate. Sodium lactate's a natural ingredient and it's a hardener. It's not necessary to add this, but it helps the soap to release from the mold and also makes it last longer. Next, I add the sodium hydroxide to the water and then I stir it in until it's completely dissolved. And I set it aside in a well-ventilated area that's safe for many kids or pets. Now that the lye is cooling, I go ahead and measure the coconut oil, and I microwave that in 30-second bursts until it's completely melted. In the meantime, I measure the liquid oil, starting with the avocado oil, and then the castor oil, and finally the olive oil. Now that my coconut oil is melted, I add the shea butter, and I'm cutting it up into smaller pieces so that it melts better. And I stir it in, and if it doesn't melt this way, I microwave it very gently. Next, I add the cocoa butter, and I'm using cocoa butter pastilles from Brambleberry. They're just really easy to work with, but you can use any kind of cocoa butter. And also with cocoa butter, I don't like to get it very hot, so I stir it in until it's melted, and if it needs a little microwaving, I microwave it gently until it's completely melted. What I mean about microwaving gently is keep an eye on it and make sure it's melted completely, but don't get it too hot. For this batch, I'm using tobacco and bay leaf fragrance. It smells so good. It doesn't smell like you would think it would smell. It's from Brambleberry and it behaves very well, although it does discolor a little bit, and I will talk about that later. I had someone ask why I pour down a stick, and especially when you have full bottles of fragrance, it likes to dribble down the side of the bottle, and when you pour down a stick, it doesn't make a mess. Okay, next we'll get started with our colors, and for the first one I'm using Firecracker, and it's a neon and it's from Elements Bath & Body. I'm using it at a rate of 1 teaspoon per pound of oils. I use a sheet of plexiglass and a palette knife, and I drizzle a little olive oil on there and I mix it in until it's completely mixed and no specks remain. And I do that because I don't want to use a stick blender to mix it in. I want it to be completely ready and able to stir in by hand, but when you don't mix it ahead of time, you have to stick blend it in, and stick blending causes acceleration, so I want my batter to remain fluid for longer, so I like to have my colorants completely dispersed ahead of time so that I can just stir them in by hand. For my next color, I'm using a combination of 3 colors, and the first is Outrageous Orange, and it's a neon, also from Elements Bath & Body, and I'm using it at a rate of 2/3 teaspoon per pound of oils. And next I'm using Firecracker again, and that is at a rate of 1/3 teaspoon per pound of oils. For my next color, I'm using Red Oxide, and it's also from Elements Bath & Body. I can't even really quantify how much I'm using in terms of teaspoons per pound of oils because I'm using such a small amount. I'm just using half of a 0.15 cc scoop. And I'm just using it to knock down that neon so it's not quite so bright. For the next color, I'm also using a combination of 3 colorants. The first color is a blue, and it's called Blew My Mind. It's a neon. And the next color is Radioactive Green, and that's also a neon, and these are from Elements Bath & Body. And then my last color is Titanium Dioxide, just to make it a turquoise color. I've already dispersed the titanium dioxide ahead of time. I use a rate of 1 part titanium dioxide to 3 parts of olive oil. For this recipe, I use 1 teaspoon per pound of oils. In the Elements Bath & Body colorant calculator, it gives you the amount for pre-dispersed colorant if you disperse it at a rate of 1 to 3 like I do. For the radioactive green, I used a rate of 0.2 teaspoons per pound of oils for this one. And for the Blue My Mind, I used 3/4 of a teaspoon per pound of oils. I measure my colorants this accurately because I want to know next time that I can recreate this batch if I want to, or change it if I want to, so I have to have an idea of what I used the last time. The way you figure out your colors is you set up a proportion. If I'm using 0.75 teaspoons per pound of oils, I would set up 0.75 over 16 ounces equals X over however many ounces I'm going to use. Then I just solve for X by cross multiplying and dividing, but you see how many colors I use. That's a lot of math. For the last color, I'm using activated charcoal or smooth coconut carbon, and I'm using a rate of 1.5 teaspoons per pound of soap. If you go to Elements Bath & Body's colorant calculator, I use the very bottom one mostly when I'm figuring colors, and I use per pound of oils, so you just put your total oil amount in the very first line, so I'm using 28.6 ounces, and then the second line is however you're dividing your batch, what percentage. Now if you wanted to use a specific amount of ounces, you would use the calculator above it, but this one I'm figuring on percentages because I'm dividing the batter 4 ways, so I'm using 25%. The next is the amount of colorant I'm using per pound of oils. So for the blue, I used 0.75 teaspoons per pound of oils. So you just hit calculate and then you get your amount. Now that the lye water is cooled, I go ahead and add the sodium lactate, and then I strain that mixture into my melted oils. I soap at temperatures between 85 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's 29 to 35 degrees Celsius. I find that this way it's not too hot. Hot batter causes acceleration, and it's not too cold because cold batter can cause false trace, and also it can cause steric spots or palmitic spots in your final batch. Next, I'm going to figure out the weight of the batter that's in my bowl, and instead of taking the spatula out of the bowl, I just tared the scale with the spatula on the scale so that it wouldn't measure the weight of the spatula too. Next, I weigh the bowl and the contents, and then I subtract the weight of the bowl, and then I just divide by 4 to get my amounts of batter for each of the 4 layers. Now that I have this amount figured out, I go ahead and stick blend my batter until an emulsion is reached. I do not go to trace, I just go to an emulsion, and that will give me time to stir in my colorants and my fragrance, and then I usually have to wait on it to thicken up. I don't use my stick blender after that, I just stir by hand. So usually I'm waiting a little bit so my batter stays fluid plenty long. I stick blend for a little bit and then I pull the stick blender out and I look at the bell of the stick blender and I'm looking for cohesion. I want the mixture to look like it's completely together and not breaking apart. When it looks a little wavery and not an even thin film, that means that you need to keep stick blending until you get that thin film that doesn't break apart or look wavery. When I reach that point, I go ahead and split my batter with the number that I calculated earlier. Now that the batter is split 4 ways, I go ahead and add my colorant and I just stir that in by hand. Next, I add 1/4 of my fragrance to each one of the pitchers, and I would suggest stirring it right away after you measure it. I don't always do that, but sometimes when I let the fragrance just sit on the surface of the batter, it will thicken up and kind of rise sometimes. So I would suggest once you get your fragrance in there, stir it in right away, at least loosely stir it in, because you can get that weird reaction when it's just on the surface for a little while. Now I just wait for my batter to become the proper thickness. I'm looking for almost a medium trace. I think The closest thing I can think of is just a little thinner than cake batter. It needs to pour easy, but you don't want it to be too thin or it kind of muddies up a little bit. And with this one, I feel like I got it really crisp and it's not necessarily as wispy. So if you're looking for a wispy look, you could have the batter thinner than this. But if you're looking for this look, you need to get the batter thick enough that it pours but doesn't get muddy and mix in with the other colors. For this one pot wonder, you probably need to elevate your mold a little bit because the depth of your pitcher might be too much to pour gradually. You might only be able to pour a lot at a time. So I used my frame for my 10-inch mold and I slid my 8-inch frame inside that, and that's how I got it elevated high enough to where I could pour gradually. As I said earlier, I don't use my stick blender anymore at this point. I'm just waiting for that batter to get to the proper consistency, usually by stirring every so often. I just wait for time to pass, and if your batter thickens up at different rates because of the colorants you used, sometimes I'll blend a little bit with the cordless mini mixer just to speed it up a little bit, but otherwise I just wait until it's the proper consistency. I think that's the error that's made a lot, is that you just get a little impatient and you want to hurry things along, but in that process it just makes it speed up and you can't pour like you would like to. I wanted to create more of a difference between the two oranges, so I added a little titanium dioxide to just adjust that color a little bit. Now that I've gotten my colors to the proper trace, I go ahead and pour, and you're going to be pouring in the reverse order. So whatever color you want on the top, you pour that first. The place that you pour in your pitcher matters too. A few of mine I poured from the back of the pitcher and I didn't really like the results. They were a little too mixed together. And I also poured a few inches away from the spout, and I decided for this one to pour halfway in between the handle and the spout, and I like the outcome of this one. Here I'm beginning the pour, and I'm showing you it in real time for a little bit just to show you how fast I'm gliding my pitcher across the edge of the mold. For this technique, since you're pouring your batter all from one pitcher, it gets kind of heavy, so I would suggest that you're pouring at a height that is comfortable for you. My table is at a regular table height, not a counter height. It still gets kind of uncomfortable as you're pouring because it's very heavy for kind of a long period of time that you're pouring. So you just kind of have to endure the pain until you finish. At this point, my batter is touching the top of the mold and I need to lessen the angle so that I can get the rest of the batter in the mold. If your batter starts to kind of bunch up, it creates kind of wavy lines instead of that crisp look, so try not to let your batter bunch up. After that, I get my soap ready for oven processing. The way I do that is I set my oven to the lowest temperature and I let it preheat for about 30 seconds to a minute. And then I cover my soap. You see I used a spacer, and then I put a sheet of plexiglass on top. I like to do that so I can see, and then I actually put another sheet of plastic wrap on top of that. I put it in the oven and I turn the oven off. You have to turn the oven off. You're only trying to create warm air around the soap. Once I turn the oven off, I turn the oven light on, and I leave that on until before I go to bed. And then in the morning, I take the soap out of the oven and wait until it comes to room temperature before I cut it. But if it's humid, I wait a few days before I cut it because you can still get soda ash, and it just cuts so much better if it's a little bit harder. So for this recipe, I would wait 48 hours to cut. Since I'm just finishing up, this is pretty self-explanatory, so I'm just going to go on to some of the tips and things that I've learned from this batch. You can get very differing results depending on where you pour the concentric circles in your mold and also how thick your batter is. I made this bar and the trace was slightly thinner, and I just wanted to show you the difference. I also poured this one a little further back in the pitcher than I poured the one that I showed you today. And also, I made one that was really super thick when I poured it, and I got kind of a neat effect. It kind of looks like licks of fire. It's really cool. You just have to spread it out pretty fast. You have to go back and forth faster than you normally did on the other ones. The amount of layers that you pour into your bowl also affects the look of your final bar. This one I poured concentric circles not too far from the spout, and it had 6 layers, and I feel like the layers just get lost when there's that many. Another thing that I would recommend is that you practice your pour ahead of time. That was the only way I realized that I needed to elevate my mold. Your pitcher needs to have enough room to pour only slightly, so it means that your pitcher is almost standing straight up. So you have to figure out if you have enough room. Another tip is that you need to use a fragrance that behaves well. This fragrance was very slow moving, but about a week and a half later, I went to look at my bars and they are very much a different color. I forgot that tobacco and bay leaf discolors to a tan color, so sadly my bars have muted down quite a bit since I took this video and the photos. I was brainstorming on some of the fragrances that I have that would have worked better and wouldn't have discolored, and I came up with Pink Grapefruit that's from Wholesale Supplies Plus, Yuzu is from Elements Bath & Body, and you can get Love Spell and Black Raspberry Vanilla from about anywhere, and Jade from Brambleberry is great, and also Black Tea. If you'd like to share the name of your favorite fragrance that's well behaved, please comment below with the name and give a shout out to the supplier. I have a free PDF download that is a list of well-behaved fragrances that people from my True Marie Soapworks group have contributed to, and if you would like to download that, I'll leave a link in the description below. I also plan on making this into a PDF recipe, and I will have it for sale on my website. There's been a lot of call for a vegan palm-free recipe, and that's what this is, so I will place a link in the first comment under the video when I get it done. I do also have free recipes that I give in the description of my older videos, and if you want to take a look, they all give you enough information to put that recipe into SoapCalc. The recipes that I have for sale on my website give you the actual measurements in ounces and grams, and they list all the supplies, and I link the instructions to the spot in my video where they apply. Thank you so much for watching today, and if you would like to receive notifications for the next time I post a video, please hit the subscribe button and then also hit the bell for notifications. Thank you and have a great day.